A Ukrainian spy has been gunned down in broad daylight in Kyiv's southern district. The intelligence officer was shot several times in a car park after being approached by an unidentified assailant. Footage circulating on social media shows the perpetrator fleeing from the scene. Authorities taking measures to disclose a motive for the shooting, trying to work out what happened and why. The US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has held in-person talks with his Russian counterpart. The meeting occurred days after President Donald Trump publicly criticised Russia for a lack of diplomatic progress. Julia Benbrook reports this morning.
This is the second time that Secretary of State Marco Rubio has met with the Russian foreign minister, but the two have talked on the phone multiple times in recent months as the United States pushed for a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine that never came to fruition. Rubio described Thursday's meeting as a, quote, frank conversation where he communicated President Donald Trump's disappointment and frustration.
There were some ideas exchanged today, some viewpoints that they expressed to us that I'll take back to the president for his consideration, and hopefully it will lead to something. I don't want to overpromise.
This meeting comes as Moscow has continued its deadly drone and missile attacks against Ukraine. And just days after Trump publicly criticized Russian President Vladimir Putin for not engaging in peace talks with Ukraine.
We get a lot of bull thrown at us by Putin, for you want to know the truth. He's very nice all the time, but it turns out to be meaningless.
Multiple times this week, Trump reiterated that Ukraine needs defensive weapons after a halt in the weapons flow to the country directed by the Pentagon set off confusion about continued U.S. military support for Ukraine. Sources familiar with the matter say that Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth did not inform the White House before he authorized that pause, setting off a scramble inside the administration to understand why the halt was implemented and to explain it to Congress and the Ukrainian government.
Joining us for more on this is Dr. Matthew Sussex, Visiting Fellow at the Australia National University's Strategic and Defence Studies Centre. Matt, good to see you. It sounds like Donald Trump is running out of patience with Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? It's a sort of rift that's been deepening ever since the Russians decided not to turn up to a meeting in Turkey, which Trump organised to try and negotiate a ceasefire in Ukraine. And since then, Trump seems to have been getting increasingly annoyed with Putin, and to the point now where he's considering this really tough sanctions bill that Congress has been putting together that would, amongst other things, put very, very heavy tariffs on countries that traded with Russia, particularly in the oil sector. So, for instance, India could face a 500% tariff if they went through. So this is certainly, tough talk from Donald Trump, and we'll have to see if in fact it bears fruit.
And is this good news then for Ukraine? As we know, Ukraine's had a bit of a roller coaster in terms of its relationship with Donald Trump and the willingness of the Trump administration to provide support to that country.
Yeah, Ash, well, typically in these situations, you'd say, wait until a country does something rather than says something. Unfortunately, with the Trump administration at the moment, you have to wait quite a while because it can do alternative things, 180-degree different things. So, the White House had held up air defense missiles for Ukraine for a while. It then reversed that. It said that it's been quietly sort of winding back some of the sanctions on Russia. Now Trump says he's considering, this very heavy sanctions deal. So whether or not it's good for Ukraine, it might be good for them in the short term. But the short term with this particular administration can be measured in hours rather than days or weeks.
We've been seeing reports this week about North Korea's increasing military involvement in the Russia-Ukraine war. What do we know so far about exactly the sort of commitment that North Korea is giving Russia?
Yeah, well, the number that's been bandied around is 30,000 troops, and that's really a considerable number, especially given the first tranche of North Koreans that went to Russia were estimated about 8,000 to 10,000, so this is 3 times as many. And that would, you'd think, probably give Russia some significant extra combat capability, basically freeing up 30,000 of its own troops, or meaning that it didn't have to draft 30,000 more from Russia itself. So this is quite a considerable escalation, and like another demonstration that we often say Russia doesn't have allies, but it does in fact have allies, and some of those allies, regrettably, are in our region.
I wanted to ask you about another story that was making headlines a little earlier this week. It involved a minister from Putin's government. He was dumped from his job only to be found dead with a gunshot wound later that same day. Should we be sceptical, do you think, of this being described as a suicide?
Well, look, this is Roman Starowitz, who was the Russian transport minister, who it seems has been potentially involved in a whole variety of different dealings in the construction industry, particularly in Kursk in Russia, where he used to be the governor. There have been stories for a while that he might have been entrapped in a sort of corruption scandal, and that this was why he was let go. The fact that he was found dead, with a gunshot wound just hours after being dismissed is another one of those things that gives you a little bit of pause. It comes just days after the deputy head of Russia's Transneft company, which does oil and fuel pipelines, fell out of a window. That marks, I think it's up to about 15 Russian senior executives or political figures who have died in somewhat questionable circumstances since the war in Ukraine began.
Goodness, a dangerous orbit to be in by the sounds of it. Matt Sussex, really appreciate your analysis. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ash.